what's fascinating is those three compounds have completely different pharmacologies. And so
Mm,
it's almost like having a brass instrument and then a couple of woodwinds on the side that can't
yeah.
be as loud and can't be as aggressive, but they're still contributing something to the whole melody. And so as we've started to look at each of these individual alkaloids, I've equated it to pulling that out of that symphony orchestra, and then we're listening to it at full blast.
Dr. Christopher McCurdy, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. And so I wanted to get started before we even dive into the specifics of your work with drugs and kratom or kratom. I know there's a bunch of different pronunciations. I'll say kratom, you say kratom, then we'll meet somewhere in the middle. We'll add an accent on there or something like that. Before we even dive into the specifics of your work, I wanted to ask you, how did you first become interested in kratom? Like, how did that even come on your radar?
Yeah, it's a great question because it was on no one's radar at the time. I think
Mm,
when I started working with it, we were working on Salvia divinorum actually, where Salvinorin A was isolated from, and we were trying to understand how Salvinorin A interacted with kappa opioid receptors, being that it structurally looked nothing like an opioid. And had no business interacting with opioid receptors according to all the current literature and understanding. And we got funded on that project from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and they invited me to come and give a talk on naturally occurring analgesic substances at a meeting. And in preparation for that, I started going through all the typical things that we know, like willow tree for aspirin, and obviously the opium poppy. And then started finding some interesting herbs and interesting plants that I had never even heard of. Mitragyna Speciosa being one of those, and it was really fascinating reading about how it was used in the native setting in Southeast Asia, particularly in Thailand and Malaysia, and then how that sort of moved into treatment for different issues that individuals were having, and it just seemed like a very ripe area that no one had really worked on. In fact, we found out that as we started researching into that program for the presentation, we found out that the most comprehensive study that was done at that point in time was really by Klein in French, which is now Glaxo Klein,
mm,
pharmaceutical company. And they essentially abandoned the project because it was around the time that the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs were coming out, so
mm-hmm.
things like ibuprofen, and they really didn't see any pain relief better than those types of drugs. Yet it still had this sort of opioid connectivity to it, and they thought, why try to get into the marketplace and compete in that space? So they abandoned it. They published everything that they knew at that point in time about mitragynin or mitragynine, the main alkaloid in the plant, and that to this day is still probably the most comprehensive study in the literature. And seeing that was published in 1972, we decided,
Yeah.
not much has been done since then, and it was pretty wide open. So we jumped into it around 2005, so close to 20 years ago, when we really started
Is
to look at it.
it is salvia? You mentioned it's salvia minora. Was
Salvia
what you were
divinorum.
sal? Is
Yeah.
that the salvia tobacco strain? Is that a
Yeah, that
strain
was
of
the one that
tobacco?
it's not really tobacco. It's a salvia species. It's from Oaxaca, Mexico.
Hmm.
Uh, and it's known as diviner's sage. And so the shaman or the medicine man would use it um, to get in touch with the spiritual world, to really understand what was happening with a patient. And if they were still stumped, they would give it to the patient and let the patient have these sort of inner visions and inner explanations of what was troubling them or what the problems were, so that they could try to get to the root of it. So
Wow.
yeah, and then it got more popular on many of the YouTube channels where people were using it and trying to get high. But the interesting thing about it is it's a kappa opioid receptor agonist, and kappa opioid receptors are dysphoric instead of euphoric. So um, many people didn't spend too much time trying to figure out what what salvia
Yeah.
was all about.
It's funny because I hadn't heard the name salvia in a long time, and I suppose one of my friends in high school probably went down the rabbit hole of YouTube and got his hands on salvia, because that was the last time I had a conversation about it, like 12 years ago, where my friend smoked it, and he told me the next day that he had a panic attack and had a conversation with a jar of cookies in his house. And I was like, thanks for telling me I'm never going to go near salvia in my life. I appreciate you letting me know. But when you brought up salvia, that conversation came back into my head where I'm like,
Mhm.
that's the only anecdotal reference I have for someone I know who's tried it. So just it awoke it awoke the cookie jar story deep in my brain.
Sorry about
No,
that.
no, no. It's funny. So with GlaxoSmithKline, or the company before GlaxoSmithKline, they were studying kratom, and before before it was possible for anything to go to the market, did they just, you said they just abandoned it because they didn't want to compete with other opioids on the market? That was the reason why they got rid of it?
Well, so it was really for moderate pain, um, just very much similar to codeine. So what they said was their conclusions in their study was that the pain relief was similar to that of codeine, and codeine's pain relief is similar to that of the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen and naproxen. And so they just figured there wasn't any use in trying to compete in a market where they would be the same roughly as codeine, or these new drugs that were being touted as non-addictive, non-problematic painkillers for mild pain, mild to moderate pain. So that was the story I got. I don't know if that's the real story,
Yeah.
but they abandoned it. There was really not any issues in terms of their toxicology reports or any reason not to go forward. The other probably main issue was from a logistical standpoint, although it was never really talked about, and that's trying to purify the natural product from the plant material in large enough quantities to go to market with. Um, Without a total synthesis, chemical synthesis was probably not available at the time. And so the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen, simple, easy chemistry to make those in mass quantities and get them out on the market. So from a business standpoint, it just didn't seem like a viable option. Is my guess.
Yeah, so you think if they continued to study kratom and they brought an alternative onto the market of an opioid that was less addictive than other opioids, or maybe not addictive at all, you think that might have wiped out the other drugs that they had patents on, so they just chose not to proceed? Like even though they had evidence it was a better drug, a better option than opioids?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to speculate on that,
Yeah.
but they definitely showed that the respiratory depression was less than opioids and the constipation was less than with opioids. And so, there was definitely some upshots to it. Um, but I couldn't speculate as to what they were thinking. If the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs were not coming up into the marketplace, that would have been another thing. But it wasn't just Smith, Klein, and French that was in that space. There was a lot of companies
Mm,
in that space.
yeah. So from when you started uh, working with Kratom, you went from salvia to Kratom, and then I know you've also had experiences testing other drugs as well, cocaine, MDMA. Uh, Let me know if I'm wrong too. I'm trying to remember the list of drugs that you've worked with. But when did you decide to focus mostly on Kratom, and what made you go into that area specifically to focus your research?
So I think there's a few things that really got me excited. One was I had developed a real strength in understanding opioid chemistry and pharmacology, and to have novel chemical structures such as salvinorin A from salvia, um, or mitragynin from Mitragyna Speciosa. These were novel chemicals that don't look like your traditional opioids, and really trying to understand how those molecules interact with the opioid receptors. What are the similarities? What are the differences? And we got excited because of the anecdotal reports of how it's been used traditionally for mood elevation, for energy, and those are things that you don't think of with traditional opioids as well. And so it was what's going on here with this plant,
Yeah,
and what's the potential? And it seemed like there was so much that could be done, and that's really what got us excited and pushing it forward. And we ran into lots of roadblocks initially trying to get funding for it, because we would talk to people at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and they would say, "Well, it's a natural product. You need to talk to the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine." And we would talk to them, and they'd say, "Well, it's got opioid activity. You need to talk to National Institute on Drug Abuse." And so it was kind of like this sort of vicious ping pong battle of
yeah.
bouncing us all over the place. And so finally, we were able to secure some funding through the National Institutes of Health, through a grant that was awarded to the University of Mississippi, where I was at the time, to look at natural products for neuroscience. So it was a very generic grant, in terms of the title, and we were allowed to have lots of projects under that grant, that as long as they were natural products and they were focused on a neuroscience application. So we were able to really kick up our research and our project under that larger grant, and start making some headway. And then we realized that there was some real potential here, in the opioid crisis that was starting to emerge as well, with a possible treatment, or at least some sort of potential piece of a solution to what could be the opioid crisis. And hearing so much from so many individual users that have just continued to increase over the years. Again, it's anecdotal evidence, but there's strong evidence that several individuals are using um, kratom in place of prescription medications now to treat their pain, and they feel like they have more energy. They feel like they can contribute back to society at a level that they could before they were on prescription opioids. And they also, quite frankly, aren't sitting on the couch and just kind of depressed. And so that's been a pretty interesting drive for us to really continue moving forward with this. And then we can probably talk about how the DEA, I think, really kind of catalyzed and accelerated all of the research. But that's kind of pre-DEA announcement, to
Hmm.
schedule the substance. And then once the DEA announced it, I think it attracted attention to public interest, as well as attention of more government agencies to really look at what the potential, or for good, or what the potential harm could be associated with it. And lots of money has been put into that area now to try and really understand what is the good, what is the bad, and what do we need to understand to keep this thing available for people to use in a proper and responsible way.
With the DEA, are you talking about their plans when they had plans to schedule it back in 2016 and then they eventually
Right,
revoked it?
right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, that drew, from my understanding, because I wasn't following Kratom at the time. I saw that uh, there were groups that collected over 100,000 signatures to petition the White House. There was an enormous outpouring of support from the Kratom community. There were even scientists that were pointing to evidence that was indicating the almost the exact opposite of some of the claims that the DEA was making about Kratom. So I wasn't I wasn't kind of seeing it unfold in real time, but looking back on the DEA incident back in 2016, that certainly seems like it would be a catalyst for people that had no idea what it was, which probably led to me discovering it, uh, just like putting it out there on the internet and sharing their own experiences and sharing anecdotes, like you were saying, and kind of sparking this a national and in many ways international kind of community to come together.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was a catalyst, in my opinion. A lot of people that never heard of it suddenly thought, oh, if the DEA is interested in banning a substance, this must be
Yeah.
interesting. So, and I think you had a whole area of people that were legitimately um, using kratom for certain purposes, mood elevation, to get off of their prescription medications, for pain treatment, for whatnot, and I think a lot of them became upset. The whole catalyst was, if this becomes illegal, we lose our access to this material that's been a lifesaver for us. And then the flip side was all the individuals that knew nothing about it that suddenly said, "Hey, this must be something pretty interesting, and let's try and push the boundaries with it." And that's where I think we started to see a lot of problematic use develop, because we've got that kind of mentality in our society, is like,
Hmm.
if it's good at this level, what if I just do a little more, or concentrate it a little more, and do some more, and see what happens. And that's not. I go back and many times try to stress that that's not the typical Kratom user. That's not the average one that's out there. The average ones are doing it in a responsible, legitimate way, and then you're always going to have these extreme folks. I think we can look at examples of other substances that are available in the United States that probably wouldn't be available if they appeared today, like alcohol and tobacco
Yeah.
and those things. Even caffeine. I mean,
Yeah.
caffeine. Caffeine would, if you would take people's caffeine away from them, there'd be a major uproar. So,
Yeah.
we're not going to see that happen.
So how would you, if you had to give a profile of a typical Kratom user that you've come across in your research, or just anecdotally, because I imagine there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people sending you their stories. How would you profile the typical Kratom user versus something like cocaine or heroin on the extreme, just to give people an idea?
Yeah, I think most cocaine or heroin users, I've never heard from a single one of them personally. I can't speak to that, but I can speak to the fact that people that are using cocaine are not really using it for therapeutic purposes, or any way to maintain a normal lifestyle. Individuals that are using heroin or something like that, obviously are using heroin at some point in their disease state of addiction, to avoid going into withdrawals and just maintaining some normalcy. But the strict fact that opiates are depressants, you've got that underlying depression that gets associated with them as well. So for and that's just saying in general, the difference is there. But with a typical kratom or kratom user, you generally don't hear those types of stories. You hear stories where people have gotten their life back. I think that's the one of the most common things that I get when I receive emails from users is gotten my life back. Able to endure the pain that I have. My pain isn't so bad. I'm able to get up off the couch and engage with my family. I'm able to hold my job down. I'm able to do the things that I was doing before I, had an issue that led me to seeking something to take,
Hmm.
or was using it to replace something that they were already taking. Those are the typical stories, and it's amazing at how consistent that message is from people that we hear from. We're doing some trials right now, not trials. I would say they're more interview type interventions through some of the National Institute on Drug Abuse intramurals, so their internal program of research that we are collaborating with and talking with. We get to hear what the reports are of the interviews that they're having with typical users, and again, the
Hmm.
same consistent story is coming through, that most of these people are able to carry on their normal life in a better way that they were before. And that, I would say, that's the majority of people that are using kratom or kratom. Then you're gonna have, as I mentioned earlier, you're gonna have the extremes of that as well. And so I get emails in a very low proportion to those that I get from people that are seeing benefits, but I get emails from individuals that are saying they're having trouble getting off of it, and they want to get off of it, and they want to stop using it. And
Hmm.
there's very little that we understand about long-term use. We've only done what we would call acute studies in animals, nothing very long term to understand what's going on, in chronic use of the substances. Um, and we certainly have no idea in humans other than what we can see, from talking to individuals. But scientifically, we have no idea if certain alkaloids are accumulating in the system, how they're being handled by our body, how our body's eliminating those that we ingest.
Hmm.
We just know little, very, very little at this point in time about any of those things. But what we do know, even in the small amount of clinical trial information that's starting to come out now, is that acute exposure, so just using it in a short term fashion, doesn't seem to cause any kind of changes in clinical chemistries, or behaviors, or anything that would be concerning from a standpoint of what we would think of with more traditional opioid use. In fact, it seems to um, not have any of those types of respiratory depressive type symptoms, or constipation type symptoms. And again, I'm talking about in a very short term study
Yeah.
for a week or 2 weeks. So that's
You've
just what
yeah,
what we've learned so far.
yeah. Yeah, it's a long road ahead. And going off of the alkaloids, something that struck me very interesting is you've said that kratom is a complex symphony orchestra of alkaloids. And I wanted to ask you, what do you mean by that on a deeper level with the alkaloid interactions? Could you describe that symphony orchestra and what's going on?
Yeah, so I came up with that analogy one day, mainly because of my love of music, but um,
What
and
type
just
of music,
thinking of,
by the way?
oh, I'm all over the place. So
Yeah.
There's if you look at my playlist, it goes everywhere from classical jazz to hip hop to heavy metal to country. So it's truly all
So
over the place.
so your individual music taste is a complex symphony orchestra of different
Exactly.
tastes.
Every genre, just about.
Yeah.
There's a few things that I can't stand, but we won't talk about that. So, uh, but yeah, that symphony orchestra seemed to be a perfect analogy because if you look at a symphony orchestra, you're looking at dozens of instruments playing together at the same time, and in the cannabis field, they refer to like an entourage effect or something like that. I do believe that with Kratom, the sum of the whole is greater than any of the individual parts um, in terms of the overall efficacy. Because what happens is that um, you have different levels of different alkaloids. Mitragyna being the major alkaloid in the majority of the products that are available in the United States, and that's from a historical perspective that the original studies that came out were actually a sampling of 3 trees,
Mm.
and they made the generalized statements that from those 3 trees, you see mitragynine being the major alkaloid, painanthine and speciogynin being the next two. But we're talking 66% for mitragynine of the total alkaloid content, and then looking down at 14, 15%, and maybe 10% for the next two. So even with those three compounds make up the majority of what's happening. But what's fascinating is those 3 compounds have completely different pharmacologies. And so
Mm.
it's almost like having a brass instrument and then a couple of woodwinds on the side that can't
Yeah.
be as loud and can't be as aggressive, but they're still contributing something to the whole melody. And so as we've started to look at each of these individual alkaloids, it's I've equated it to pulling that out of that symphony orchestra, and then we're listening to it at full blast, right?
Mm.
And so we're seeing all the effects of this one piece, and it's almost an analogous to cooking and coming up with a dish that has all these different spices and ingredients in it. And somebody may not like straight garlic on its own, but if you throw garlic in with your Italian pasta dish, comes in nicely and it just sits in there well. So I think it's looking at it from this perspective, and what we're learning from each of these different compounds is that they all have different pharmacological effects associated with them, some of which can also be pain killing properties, but through different systems than the opioid system. So we've demonstrated that there's activity in the adrenergic system, which is where our sort of fight or flight system,
Mm.
where adrenaline, noradrenaline, or epinephrine, norepinephrine bind to those types of targets. We've also seen activity through serotonin receptors, which we know are involved in mood elevation. But serotonin is also involved in pain and relieving pain. And so you get this complex soup of what we used to call dirty pharmacology,
Yeah.
which is what most of our psychiatric medications are these days that are still prescribed and used. They interact with multiple receptor systems in our bodies to have their end result. And
Dirty.
that's
It's
really
like
what
the it's like the orgy of pharmacology, dirty pharmacology. Just
that's
multiple partners working on you at the same time.
That's right, and that's why
Yeah.
they've changed it to polypharmacology, which is no
Yeah.
different in your description. So, uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
But
that's exactly
yeah,
what's going on.
yeah, because when you if someone's never heard about kratom, and I experienced it when I was just searching around for information, And for people listening, I use Kratom almost daily. I enjoy writing on it in the morning. I'll take half a teaspoon to write in the mornings, and I will take about a teaspoon to do podcasts. And when I first started learning about the drug, there were a bunch of articles at the top of Google when you search for Kratom that compare it to heroin or opioids, and there's this constant thing where you only see the kind of like the opioid pharmacology comparison, which is why I wanted to ask you about like that symphony, that orchestra effect, because would that like kind of tunnel vision opioid comparison to kratom, would that be incorrect if people are leaving out the other impacts that it has on other systems of the brain?
Yeah, I think it's just wrong to call it an opioid. I think it's even wrong to call it an atypical opioid, which is the way that a lot of people want to sort of categorize it, because it is much more than opioid. Even the major ingredient, mitragynine. I mean, we don't see that being a very strong opioid at all by itself. Um, there are some compounds in the plant. They're in very very minor amounts that seem to have more of a pure opioid like effect. In
Mm,
fact, there's the 7-hydroxymitragynine that gets talked about a lot as what we've learned is really a metabolite of mitragynine. It's produced in the intestine, it's produced in the gut after we ingest the leaf material. We don't think it's produced in the tree. And we've got a couple papers coming out in the next month or two that'll sort of underscore some of the biosynthetic pathways that we've looked at in the plants, and really trying to understand the biochemistry, and how these plants are producing the alkaloids. And we don't find any enzymes, at least to this point, that will convert mitragynine to 7-hydroxymitragynine in the plant. So we think that what's happening is when the leaves are harvested from the tree, um, that there's some chemical changes that are happening post harvest,
mm,
and those can be pretty quick, and just in minor amounts, pretty quick. And then we had seen um, a so we sort of did a survey of products that were available in the marketplace, and we published it in 2016, where we thought there was some suspected adulteration of kratom
mm.
products in the marketplace, because we saw levels that were 600 times higher than what we normally had seen in with 7-hydroxy levels in certain products that we were picking up off the marketplace. And it just kind of blew us away, and thought, well, people maybe are adding more powder to it. But then as we started to investigate, one, there's not enough in the raw plant material to isolate and then
Yeah.
add on top. And second, if they were doing something to grossly oxidize the whole plant material, you would see a lot more changes to the material than just that compound. And third, even from a synthesis point of view, it would be ridiculous for someone to spend that much money and time and effort, and then to add that back into a product on the marketplace. And so I can happily say that um, we just finished running an analysis of hundreds of samples from all over the United States that individuals sent in, and we don't see 7-hydroxy levels in the current market environment, and that's really encouraging, because that's really the one compound that I would be extremely concerned about if it was in the plant and if people enriched it in the plant. There's a lot of reports out there in Reddit and other spaces where people have tried to boost the 7-hydroxy levels by
Yeah.
adding chemicals to their kratom, and that's incredibly dangerous. They're incorrectly saying that these oxidants are, inert and don't cause any harm, and that's the furthest thing from the truth. So we've actually tried to reproduce a lot of that chemistry in our own lab, and boy, you create so much more chemicals. It's almost like burning a cigarette, where you have a certain number of chemicals that we know are in there, and then you light that cigarette, and now it's thousands of chemicals more because of the pyrolysis that's happening. And so we see a lot of danger there. But
Well, you tell people
from
it's like
from the
smoking a cigarette, and you might recruit more people to try that.
yeah,
Sounds like a hell of a drug to me.
yeah,
Um,
I would hate to see
but
that.
yeah, I was actually reading the abstract of the paper you mentioned, suspected adulteration of kratom, and
Mhm.
you alluded to it, but it sounded like you were basically combing internet forums. You mentioned Reddit, seeing these internet chemists performing their own experiments on kratom and trying to extract the 7 hydroxy or increase the potency of it, and so you were basically mimicking these internet experiments in the lab to see if this would account for what you were seeing in the commercial products, because that's
Right.
wild. That's a wild job.
Yeah. Well, it was a crazy idea. It
Yeah,
turned out to be a crazy idea as well, because we just ended up making a mess.
yeah,
So, and I couldn't. I just we would sit around and say, "Gosh, I can't imagine trying to ingest all these additional things that have been made, plus the oxidant, which could just chew up your intestines pretty bad." So,
yeah.
uh,
On
anyway,
a
that's a
on
whole nother subject.
Yeah, but on a broad level, do you ever, when you're doing those type of things, do you ever sit back and think, "Holy shit, this is my job. I get paid to play around and research with drugs and then report my findings," because it sounds like one of the coolest jobs in the world.
Well, thanks. I love it. I mean, that's one of the things that's a beautiful thing. When you love what you do, you really don't work. So,
Yeah.
we have the opportunity to go in and learn something, that millions of people are ingesting every day, and try and learn what do we need to learn about this for advice to people, and how can we help make sure that policy, when it's made by people who aren't scientists, how can we influence that policy to
Yeah.
be done in a responsible
Yeah.
manner, so that people ultimately can have access to a product that seems to be beneficial to them without having harm associated with it. So that's, we look at it from a, I mean, it almost sounds all altruistic too much, but that's really what we do. I mean, it's fun to do it, and it's fun for us to really push the boundaries in the lab, and see what's safe, what's not safe. What happens right now. We're looking at pregnancy. What happens during pregnancy with people that take
Mm.
kratom? Is it safe to use as an alternative? A lot of people think that because it's natural, it's safe, and they can replace their prescription opioids with it. And at this point, I mean, we haven't drawn any conclusive statements other than it's not probably not safe to use during pregnancy, and
Mm.
we wouldn't recommend it. But we've got a lot of work still to do in that
Yeah.
space as well.
And what you're doing is also you're helping millions of people too, because there are uh, and I would say Kratom is certainly one of these communities. There are communities that surround certain drugs where people genuinely want to use them to live a more fulfilled life and a more enhanced life, and they want to treat others kindly. They want to pay attention. They're not looking for an escape necessarily. Not that it's wrong every once in a while to look for an escape, but Kratom seems like one of the drugs where like the community is avid about it, the drug having a good reputation. And so I imagine that most people are sensitive to the information that researchers like yourself and other labs are putting out, that people are going, sharing it in Reddit. Like, I couldn't believe how many people were in the Kratom forums on Reddit. Like, if you add all of them up, it has to be like almost 500,000 people just in those two or three top forums. Like, it's crazy. And then there's a lot of first person accounts. There's the latest research articles shared. There's, do this, don't do that, whatever. Just people like genuinely, it seems like trying to help other people have a better experience. And what you're doing is only adding to that. It's foundational because everything starts with the facts.
Well, thank you, and that's our goal. Our goal is to really understand the product and understand what what a safe way to use it is. And even though we don't actually do studies in humans, we do everything in animals. We're extrapolating all that information from what we learn into animals, and then hopefully being able to share that and at least provide some guidance. I can't tell you how to take it or how, an individual how to use it. I'm not a physician, so we're
Yeah.
just. I joke and say all of our patients are rodents, so it's, they don't talk to us. They just bite.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I wanted to ask you about dosage, and you could tell me how your rodent patients respond to various doses. There's this anecdotal idea amongst users where a low dose is something more like coffee, like it has more of a stimulation effect, and a higher dose is more like the nodding off classic opioid effect. Pharmacologically, do you see anything in the lab that points you to believe that that is what's happening in the body? Do you see people on low doses, or not people, but like the animals on low doses respond more like stimulants, and then high doses, it's more lethargic? Does that have any truth to it?
Yeah, it's very interesting because the rodents that we work with are usually mice or rats. Majority of them are rats. And yeah, at lower doses we see interesting behaviors. More, I want to be careful what I say because it's not, even though it appears to be more focused behavior, more intentional behavior, where they're more alert and whatnot. Whereas if you start to push the doses a little bit higher, you will see greater analgesic effects. You will see greater sort of anti-anxiety, you know, not really. They don't really go to sleep, or anything like that. And we're not able to, with the animal care and usage committees anymore. We're not really able to look at pushing toxic doses and seeing what will happen at the high ends of things. We have had some animals that have gotten too much at times, and interestingly enough, we start to see something that looks very much not like um, opioid overdose. It looks more like adrenergic overdose, so stimulant overdose, or
Hmm.
or something like a serotonin syndrome where you have too much serotonin activity. So what happens is these animals go into seizures,
Oh, wow.
um, and and
And
we
this
we
is at the
can,
higher doses.
at very high doses, right? And these are not experienced rats. Like, they're not using it every day, and they're not accustomed to using it, and they obviously we're giving it to them, so they're not taking it themselves and
Yeah.
controlling what they're getting. But when we've pushed doses probably to the edge of what we're allowed to do, in certain animals, we've seen seizures develop, and that's not different from what we've seen reported to poison control centers and emergency department reports of individuals that have called in or arrived in emergency rooms with quote unquote overdose, or they've taken enough material that they've gotten to a adverse reaction that's concerning to them, so they call the poison control center to find out what to do, or they end up in the emergency room. Most of those individuals are agitated, irritated. They may have increased blood pressure. They may have seizures, even, but very few have respiratory depression. Very few have any kind of depressive type activities associated with it. And so that's what you would see with an opioid. I mean, you would see that respiratory depression, you would see that dozing off, that heart rate slowing down, all of those things that we think of with a depressant versus what we think of with a stimulant overdose, which is that sort of increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased irritation. So those are the things that we've noticed. And then that begs the question for how do you treat someone that is in that situation? Do you give them opioids to try to give them an opioid antagonist? Is it going to be a benefit? We don't know. So there's a lot of interesting questions that we're still formulating. We're still trying to figure out experiments of how to mimic these things and how to best inform what's happening in the real world.
So if you had a scale that went from coffee to gas station heroin, in terms of potential for abuse and withdrawal, where would you put Kratom on that scale?
Yeah, so I can speak to it from that sort of short-term use, that non-chronic use. And what I would suggest in that case is that we actually see very, very mild withdrawal. And in fact, the clinical trial data that was presented this summer at the College on Problems of Drug Dependence meeting was from one of the clinical trials that was conducted in Canada. And what they released was the withdrawal, sort of subjective opiate withdrawal scale, or what we call the SAWS, subjective opioid withdrawal scale. And they classified it as mild. And mild in that case is about the same type of withdrawal classification that you would have with coffee. So a lot of emails I get are people that are frustrated that we compare Kratom withdrawal to coffee withdrawal, because they're coming from the standpoint where they may be using it for a long time and they want to get off of it, and they're having much more severe symptoms. And those things we just simply don't know. We don't know what long-term chronic use is and what the withdrawal could be that's associated with that. I eat lunch oftentimes with a couple of local addiction physicians. And interestingly enough, a few years ago when we started having lunches, the discussions were, hey, we're seeing people self-treat to get off of opioids. And this is really interesting. And we've started to talk to them in more detail about it. And I said, well, I'm very interested to hear how that progresses. And then about a year ago, I was having lunch with them and they said, well, you wouldn't believe it, but we've got people that are using these things to get off, like we talked about before, but now we're seeing people show up that want to get off and are having a hard time getting off. And
Wow.
we haven't really gone into a lot of detail to understand what type of products they're using, how often they're using, what their frequency is. But the general discussion around that has been the consumption level has gotten to an incredibly high amount of material. that these individuals are using. Case in point, someone was discussing using 90 grams a day, which is, I mean, that's to me a lot.
Yeah. Yeah,
And then the cost
I have some accounts on Reddit from both sides that I wanted to get into, to be fair. But before that, just to go off of the mild withdrawal, for me, that seems fair. That's just with my own personal use. I'm not saying that applies to everyone or should apply to everyone, but just to give people an idea who are listening, this is completely anecdotal. I'm a 5'11", 180-pound male. I take between 2 to 3, like tops 4 grams per day, and I was looking for kratom as an alternative to coffee, and I'm not using it to get off opioids or anything like that. So I wasn't coming at it as like a replacement for a strong thing. I was coming at it as like I was having anxiety. I wanted to get lower the bar of caffeine in my life, and so I came across kratom. And I actually find that my mood is disturbed more by being off coffee for a couple weeks than being off kratom for a couple weeks, because I'll regularly go anywhere from a week to 6 weeks multiple times throughout the year without using kratom. And so I'm going from 2 to 4 grams a day to 0 a day for an extended period of time. And then maybe the first day I'll have like a little bit of heightened anxiety. And then after that, it's just normal. But with coffee, I feel like a 2 to 3 to 4 day, like noticeable slump and agitation and headaches. So for me, I would say it's even milder than coffee. But again, I'm only one person, and that doesn't apply to everyone.
Yeah, no, it is interesting though. Um, for anxiety purposes too, because caffeine, even though early on caffeine can sort of decrease anxiety, caffeine at higher levels is known to be anxiogenic or increase anxiety. And so we definitely know that about caffeine. We know that about long term caffeine use. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of individuals. I talk to people from South America, and they love to use coca leaf tea because coca leaf tea is, they say, better than coffee. They're not getting the caffeine, and they're definitely not getting cocaine from the amount that's in there. But they love how it is easy on their stomach, how it makes them feel relaxed and whatnot, versus coffee. And I've heard the same with kratom and kratom. I
Yeah.
mean, it's just exactly what your story is. And I think keeping doses in the ranges that you're in, from what we've seen and what we've seen even anecdotally in the human side, it doesn't seem to be a problematic thing. It's when the doses start to get higher and higher. The other issue is some of the concentrated extracts that are out there, and the fact that I kind of look at that as a comparison between drinking a light beer, which was maybe 4% alcohol tops, to
Yeah.
a shot of 151, right? And drinking 12 ounces of 151 versus 12 ounces of uh, 4% beer is very, very different. But some of these individuals using the concentrated alkaloid shots are down in 3, 4, 5 at a time, and that's when you can start to see other problems coming.
Yeah,
So
even with other drugs too. I've smoked weed, many a times, but there have been times where I'm comparing my weed experiences like they're 1 to 1. So I'll take 2 hits of a joint. The THC content isn't the THC concentration isn't super high, so I'm like, okay, 2 hits is where I feel good. And then my other friend will have a pen, and I'm like, all right, I took 2 hits of the joint. I'll take 2 hits of this. And then I feel like my brain's splitting apart. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? Like this is not consistent at all. So, um, Yeah, just like the extracts versus the powder just made me think about the like it makes it so much easier as a user of any substance, any drug, to have like a good method of comparison. And sometimes if you don't know what's in it, you can be shot to Mars without even realizing it.
Yeah, yeah. It's all, it comes down to anything. The dose is the key, and the dose makes the
Hello?
determination whether it's going to be safe. Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
So I wanted to. And we're back from an internet disruption, by the way. If you're listening to this and you're like you just skipped over, um, so the Wi-Fi gods will hopefully smile on us for the rest of the episode. I wanted to get your thoughts on a couple of anecdotes from Reddit from two of the biggest Kratom accounts online, and I wanted to start with the negative first and then a positive. So the first one is from the Quitting Kratom Reddit, and then the second one is from the Kratom Reddit, just to be fair, to get kind of both sides. And so the first one, the title of this account is 3 years sober from an extreme Kratom habit. And this person writes, "What a difficult journey it has been. I was about a 75 gram per day user. Quitting Kratom was one of the hardest things I've had to do in my life. I learned the hard way that Kratom causes withdrawals on a work trip 3 years ago. I should have stopped then and there, but I gave in because the RLS, restless leg syndrome, was so bad. Eventually, I realized that I was constantly hiding this Kratom addiction, always capping up powder whenever I had to go on trips or even be away from my apartment for longer than 6 hours. It wasn't healthy, and I started to notice the withdrawal symptoms more and more and more." So, just reading that account, is there anything that strikes you about the dosage or the description, anything like that?
Yeah, the dosage is high for sure, and it's not. There was nothing that sounded surprising in that description to me. From some of the emails that I've received, as I mentioned, getting emails from people that want to get off of it and are having trouble with, particularly restless leg syndrome, and all of these individuals have been very high amount users. So, and I don't mean high in the terms of euphoric high. I mean high in the terms of the amount they're consuming each day. And we don't know. We haven't studied. We haven't even studied in high doses, in short term, what those animals would look like. And we've been trying to understand, the opposite. How much can we get away with using where we can see beneficial effects, and not push the doses high? Because really, in reality, the two ways that it's traditionally consumed are chewed fresh leaf in Thailand, and then brewed teas in Malaysia. And the
Mm,
teas, when you're boiling the leaves in water, they do it for 3 hours to make the tea. It's a very inefficient way of extracting the compounds out of the leaf, and we know that because we do it in the lab all the time. And so you're getting even lower doses, of alkaloids in those teas. And then when you're chewing fresh leaf material, they're not chewing, as much material as is being ingested, in tablespoons of powder. So,
yeah.
there's a big difference into how it's used and how it's consumed. And so, when you start thinking about, doses, exceeding these levels, you just mentioned 65 grams a day. We just have no idea what the science is behind that, or what else is going on. And gosh, we have a lot to learn, and those are things we haven't even been able to investigate in animals yet. But now, again, we're getting the anecdotal stories from, human users, which I mean, we call them anecdotal because there's no way for us to understand the full scientific parameters around them. But wow, again, human usage is outpacing the fact of how we can explain and understand these things. And cannabis use is another wonderful example of where we have way more human knowledge than we do scientific knowledge about how it's used and how it's beneficial. And in this case, we see that. But I have heard from some individuals, as I mentioned, I get much less emails about people trying to get off than I get from people who are benefiting. But the restless leg syndrome is one that's definitely there. We are working with several epidemiologists on coming up with definitions of what would be called kratom use disorder, because there are definitely individuals out there that are meeting criteria for a substance use disorder, and we want to specifically understand what a kratom use disorder would be, and then how can we potentially offer treatments for that. And that's a long road ahead again.
Yeah, it's just really interesting combing through the different Reddit groups and reading about different people's experiences, because when you're combing through and reading the stories, in my mind they start to drop
I've lost
into
you again. I don't know.
Okay, can you hear me, Chris? Can you hear me? All right. So before things got cut off, I was just saying that combing through the hundreds of stories on Reddit, just looking through what people were saying, getting ready for this podcast, in my mind, things started to drop into three different buckets, which is you have people who are looking for an alternative to something like coffee or caffeine. And so they start out at a lower dose, like sometimes less than a single gram, and then they might go up to 5, maybe 10 grams in a serving, but they rarely go beyond that. You have the other end of the spectrum where you have people that might be looking to get off an opioid, like something a lot stronger. And so they start at a very high dose because they're trying to get an effect that's much stronger than something like coffee. And that definitely seems less than the amount of people who are staying at the lower dose. And then I would say it was rare to see someone write about starting at the lower dose and then gradually ramping up to something like 75 grams a day. Like, I didn't really read about people going from like 1 to 2 grams and then 6 months later they're taking like 70 grams in a single day. So that was more rare. But to me, that's just kind of what I was seeing on Reddit, going off of that person's experience. It definitely seems like they were coming from the extreme end of the spectrum where they're starting with something that would be considered a higher dose.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's pretty typical of the normal users. They're using a lower dose. And we were talking about this the other day. It's interesting that we've got individuals that we've been talking to that have been using kratom for over 10 years now, and not having issues with it from their use, because they're using low amounts. And again, I just come back to the fact that the poison is sort of in the dose, right? So the problems can be, once doses get to certain levels with anything, it can be more problematic than not.
Yeah. And so, yeah, that first account was from the Quitting Kratom Reddit. I wanted to give one from the Kratom Reddit. And so the title of this one is Getting a Little Bummed Out at the Hate Kratom Gets for Being quote unquote addictive. And this person says, I don't know, I guess because for me, I'd rather drink Kratom tea than drink alcohol. It's a plant and I use 2 grams or less per day. I have several times over the years gone on a trip of some kind and went a week without kratom and didn't give it a second thought. Surely after drinking it for years, if it was addictive, I would have had withdrawals. been obsessively thinking about it, question mark, does anyone have similar experiences? So I would say I'm more in that bucket where, you know, around 2 to 4 grams per day. If withdrawal symptoms are happening, it's very minimal, and kind of being on that opposite end of the spectrum. Do you have any thoughts on what that person said and their account?
Yeah, like I was saying, and I don't know how much we caught before we had the internet blip, but
Yeah.
um, it's interesting because we have a lot more human data than we have scientific data, and anecdotal data, because we simply don't have those controlled clinical parameters around how it was used, what was the dose, and the dose could be a little different every time because it is a natural product. It depends on what lot you had or whatnot. And so these are some things we just don't know. One of the studies that we've carried out in animals is definitely looking at the lower doses. We're trying to figure out what's the lowest amount you can use to help people get off of prescription drugs, or what's the lowest amount you can use to get some of these anti-anxiety or mood elevation benefits. And we're not trying to push doses too high, and we definitely do not see in animals. We don't see much abuse potential at all.
Hmm.
But again, we're using these low doses, and so I think it's a really difficult thing to make a generalized statement about right now, because we just don't understand what chronic use is, what higher doses look like, and what the difference in those situations look like. Then the piece that makes it even more complicated is genetics. We don't know if there's any kind of genetic component to not the addictive side of it, but how the body is handling the plant material. How is it
Hmm.
eliminating the plant material, metabolizing it? Are some individuals more prone to hold on to these compounds more so than others in their bodies, and then therefore accumulate to higher doses and higher doses? It's There's so much we just don't understand from a science level to say yes it's this or yes it's that. But
Yeah.
what we do understand is what we see in the animals, which acutely and at small doses doesn't appear to be addictive. But
Yeah.
as soon as I say those things, I get a couple emails from people that say, how can you say this? Because we're struggling. So
Yeah.
I feel for that.
How do you weigh anecdotes when you're reading stories that may run parallel to the research that you're doing in the lab? Do you sift through them and kind of look for signs that someone's being more truthful or maybe more transparent? Like, does that come into account when you're looking at studying a possible effect of kratom or maybe just drugs in general? Like, how do you sift through the anecdotes reliably when you're looking at what people are writing about a certain drug?
Yeah, it's
Because
hard,
there's so
and
many.
yeah,
That's
well,
so like
that's it.
thousands.
That's it. And I think
Yeah.
the nice thing is there's extraction tools that you can use for research on Reddit and whatnot, and so we will try to look for consistencies, um, and patterns that seem to point us in a direction that we should study. Um, you know, Pregnancy was one that came out of a number of avenues. One was because of comments made on Reddit. One was because we were contacted by pediatricians that had babies that were born um, in withdrawal, that the mothers claimed that all they took was kratom. So we want to understand what's happening there, and these are some of the ways that we sort of pull anecdotal, really real world evidence pieces that we see, and it could be some of the extremes that we've seen from emergency department reports or poison control center reports. What can we learn there? What can we understand? The other piece that I didn't even get to was, um, you know, most people that are consuming kratom are not doing it in a vacuum. I mean, they're doing it in presence of caffeine. They're doing it in the presence of other substances, alcohol, whatnot, and may not think twice about it. But we have no idea how all those substances are playing with each other once they get inside the body, and what's going on. And so, to what extent some individuals may have a more negative experience could also depend on what other things they're using or what other substances they have or what their history was prior to using substances, what their health is, what their diabetic status is, their cardiovascular system status. There's so many factors to play into it, and when we talk to generally healthy people that are using it like you are, generally we don't hear any issues. And it's not to say that there's not going to be those cases of problems in healthy individuals, but yeah, it's hard to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, no, that's something that, it can be annoying that there's a lack of nuance when it comes to the drug conversation, because you have people with all different types of genetics and behaviors, discipline, jobs, mental health. People are, our consciousnesses are constantly varying in different states. You could be after a breakup, maybe you just get like the job of your life. You're trying to fill a hole. You feel at peace. You're taking a drug to enhance, you're taking a drug to block out. Like there are literally millions of different factors that go into why someone would choose to do a drug. But when it comes to a conversation at the general level, it usually devolves into, I would say Reddit can be a little bit more nuanced, although it can turn into a dumpster fire pretty quickly. But especially on Twitter, where you're limited in 240 characters, things are just like black and white, like this is it or this is it, and everything is saying yes or no, and it's never an and conversation, like this is true and this is also true. So that's just been something that's annoyed me about the conversation about substances in general, where there's no it seems to be like there's no nuance in acknowledging the different lifestyles that people have and how that affects what they're doing. And also, of course, biology and upbringing is a huge factor too. But I would just like to see, and it looks like we're going in this direction, a more personalized approach to drug use, where you go to your doctor and it's not like this is good, this is bad. It's like, you can talk about how things are in your life and whether this is more of a risk for you or less of a risk, or how it's affecting your relationships and things like that, and not just a broad stroke of do this and don't do that.
Yeah, I think that the sort of psycho, um, I don't know exactly how to say it, but the definitely, some sort of counseling coupled with what's going on is always a good thing, because you know understanding what experiences you should have, how you should have it, what other things are contributing to factors in your life that need to be under control as well. There's a whole deal about taking a drug in the right set, in the right setting, and making sure that the experience is well controlled. We're seeing that right now with psychedelic trials, and of course, psychedelics are way more powerful than than what we're talking
Yeah.
about here, in terms of what they do to your mental capacity. But it is interesting, and it is something that that will not probably ever have a good answer to, unfortunately.
Yeah. So you've said that kratom, in your view, could be the next medical marijuana. Are you talking about the different strains, the marketing of it? Like, what do you mean when you say kratom's going to be the next you know medical weed big
Yes,
industry?
I just think that there's a lot of comparisons to the amount of different indications that people are using it for, just like you see with marijuana. But also coming back to, I'm not sure if it's really a strain issue or not. But what we're learning, and we have a really amazing team of scientists here that we're working together with, for all the way from understanding how to cultivate the tree, and the genetics of the tree, and as I mentioned earlier, the biosynthetic pathways of making these compounds in the tree. And I alluded to it earlier, that first sort of report that ever came out and said mitragynin or mitragyne is the major alkaloid in the plant, and that was only a sampling of 3 trees. So while we found trees in the same farms in Southeast Asia that are right next to each other, where one tree produces high levels of mitragynin and another
Mm,
tree next to it is producing almost none. So you can almost get to a point where you're talking about things that are like hemp, right? That are below, well, we call it below 0.3% THC is hemp, but you could have very low levels of THC and other cannabinoids at very high levels, versus very high levels of THC and lower levels of things like CBD and whatnot. We see something similar in the different, what we call chemotypes, of the Mitragyna Speciosa tree. So they all produce mitragynin, but they
mm,
do it at varying levels, and we see that there may be 2 or possibly 3 different chemotypes of the tree. But what's in the marketplace in the United States is really targeted at a level of mitragynin content, and that's what products are analyzed for, and that's what the vendors are looking for. They want to have at least this much mitragynin content. And so what we're trying to understand now, and what some of our funding from the National Institute on Drug Abuse now is, to really look at some of these differences in the combinations of alkaloids. So if we are looking at a typical product that we would buy in the U.S. marketplace, it's going to be highest alkaloid will be mitragynin.
mm,
But what about some of these other trees that are producing almost no mitragynin? And interestingly enough, and again anecdotally, many of the trees that were first donated to us for research purposes from users in Florida actually had that low level of mitragynin content.
wow.
And they would tell us that they were getting the exact benefits that they were getting with their purchased product, and they felt so much better about what they were doing because they were growing their own material and they were controlling their environment. Um, Little did many of them know they had bug infestations that were pretty crazy on their plants, but hey, that's another
Mm,
story.
yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting situation, and the idea, I guess, is why could it be the next medical marijuana? Do we look at varying concentrations where you have, just like at cannabis dispensaries, you see ones that are high percentage of THC all the way down to almost no THC, and can we start to see that with some of the same things with kratom, and then the other alkaloids that are in there, just like we see with cannabis, where you have CBD, CBN, CBG, all these different cannabinoids. We have different alkaloids in the kratom plant that have different pharmacologies, as we talked about earlier, and could these be exploited if we can understand how to how the plant is producing one alkaloid over another. Can we understand how to make strains that could be beneficial for specific things, like attention in a coffee in the morning versus and you wouldn't have to worry about these other euphoric type things or being tired. These are the big, wide, crazy ideas that we have. Just thinking about can we really understand what all these combinations of alkaloids are, and how can we best benefit those for treating individuals for things that they really want treatment for.
Yeah, and in addition to the concentration, you also see a lot of different marketing for the different veins, like the green vein, red vein, white. Have you seen different effects with the different colored veins in the lab, or is that more of a marketing thing for kratom commercial use?
Yeah, so it's a fantastic question. It's a question that we have an answer for that won't make vendors that happy.
That's
But
okay.
it
I'm
is
not a
a lot.
vendor.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, a lot of it is marketing. You can there's essentially 4 or 5 different colors of kratom leaf powder that come into the United States, and those can be kind of greenish, whitish, all the way to a little darker green to brown to red, in fact. And so you can see some darker powders that almost look red. They're probably more auburn brown ish, but yeah, you see these varying colors, and we've done analysis of those various colors of product, and they all look pretty much the same,
Hmm.
alkaloid content wise. Now, alkaloids, we focused this whole conversation around alkaloids, but as we know, just like with cannabis, there's more than just cannabinoids in cannabis. There's terpenes, there's other um, volatile, volatiles, other types of molecules that are in there, and we've got the same thing with kratom. We've got more than just alkaloids in there. There's lots of other categories of compounds, and they may contribute to some of the differences that are seen in those leaf colors. But we can say that the alkaloid contents appear to be pretty
Hmm.
standard across the board in those. The other thing I'll comment just briefly on is the trees. What we've seen growing trees in the native environment, and those trees will have red vein leaves on them, green vein and white vein leaves, all on the same tree, sometimes even on the same branch.
Oh, wow.
uh, and then it comes down to sort of the age of the leaf on the tree, and how soon it's been there, and how long it's been on the leaf. I'm sorry, on the branch of the tree. We have a paper that'll be coming out hopefully that sort of goes into that detail, where we actually harvested newly emerged leaves versus a little bit larger leaves versus the more mature leaves on the tree. And definitely there's differences in alkaloidal content in those different stages of leaves, even on the same tree. But to go out and harvest specifically red vein leaves, and then
Hmm.
harvest specifically green vein and specifically white vein, it would be a monumental task that I don't think the individual farmers are up for. They're
Yeah.
just like, harvest what we can harvest, throw it all together, and throw it in the truck so it goes off to
Yeah.
wherever it goes.
So when people are self-reporting different effects with different colored veins, like green keeps me awake, red is good for sleep. I'm just making those up. That could be the case, but when people are self-reporting these different effects for different colors, it's possible that there are molecules other than the alkaloids that are accounting for the different effects that people are feeling. So you haven't nailed that down yet, but it's possible you could find something in the future that shows variations in mood enhancement across different colored strains, regardless of the dose.
Yeah, yeah. And it could be again this complex symphony orchestra idea, where it's not just one thing, it's a combination of alkaloids with materials in that leaf that are causing whatever the effect is. So
So
yeah, the complexity of natural products is, I mean, heck, they've been around for centuries and decades, or millennials for reasons. So
yeah, I'm gonna just take a quick bathroom break and I'll be right back. I'll just be 2 minutes. So we before you mentioned people going into the hospital with possible overdoses on kratom. In some cases, there may be other substances in the system that are accounting for the feelings or diagnosis of overdose. So I wanted to ask you, can you overdose on kratom? What does an overdose look like on kratom, and how much does it typically take for the average person to overdose?
yeah, so I'll start with the last one first. I have no idea what the dose is that would cause someone to overdose. Um, in general, for people that are starting out, or naive to kratom, for example, one of the clinical trials that was conducted, they had to exclude a couple of individuals because after they took the 2 gram dose, they vomited, and so they basically kicked everything out of their system that they put into it.
Wow.
And with leaf material and powders, that's generally what will happen before you would get to a situation where there would be an overdose. At least that's our working hypothesis right now. Where you start to see problems is again in these extract concentrated products where people can consume a tremendous amount in a short amount of time, um, and it can be, it can bypass sort of that protective mechanism that our bodies have of vomiting because so much gets absorbed so quickly.
Yeah.
Um, we don't we basically base our information from poison control center calls and emergency department visit records that indicate most of the individuals that show up because they end up in sort of a panic, a concern. They get this racing heart. They get severely agitative, aggressive, and in some cases can go into seizure, as I mentioned earlier. All of those type of not normal behaviors generally will
Yeah.
tend to make either the people that individual is with, or sort of try to seek help for them. In terms of substances that the United States Food and Drug Administration actually has a nice, well, I don't know if I say nice, but it's a very informative website. It's called
Yeah.
Fears. It's a Fears database, and so what it is it's a recording of adverse event systems, and we've also mined a lot of that to see what adverse events have been reported to the FDA with kratom that would lead to poison control or emergency department visit. And there's lots of combinations of drugs with kratom that seem to be problematic. A lot of those are including opioids along with it. Many of that's also
Mm.
benzodiazepines with it. We now starting to see um, some other drugs starting to emerge with kratom use as well that are problematic, and so we're also actively trying to figure out what's going on in the animals with these drug combinations, and how can we better understand, what to tell people not to ingest with these products. And so those are a lot of the things that we see. Yes, you can overdose on kratom. I mean, you can overdose on anything. You can overdose on water. I mean, there have been reported fatalities where people have drank too much water too quickly, and they get water intoxication, and it can
Yeah.
be fatal. So I think
Cheers.
anything that's out there, yeah, cheers. Anything that's out there could be problematic, and it's a matter of understanding where those boundaries are, and what is safe to consume before you start to get into those problems. And we just don't understand all of
Yeah.
that yet, particularly in humans, let
Yeah.
alone in animals.
If you had to speculate on the biggest potential hazards for human use down the line, what are the biggest potential hazards you think may arise based on what you see in the lab for humans? Is it the mixing of drugs? Is it the amount of kratom? Like what's something that it sticks out in your mind when you think about like the potential for an adverse effect?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes down to dose. So what we see in animals, particularly if we're giving them leaf material like you would ingest in powder or capsule form, we see a pretty well understood and controlled distribution of compounds into the blood supply. When we see extract materials, whether those are extracts that we created in the lab with organic solvents, or they're extracts that we're buying from the marketplace, you definitely see a much more rapid, higher exposure of compounds into the blood supply than what you see with the others. And so, again, I go back to saying that the poison is in the dose, and that's the big concern. Number one. Number two, I would say that understanding what it's safe or not safe to take with is the other emerging thing. And we've luckily there's a lot more labs studying this material now than just us, and we should be able to get a lot more answers quicker than what we've been doing for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
We've certainly accelerated what we're doing, and these are all things that are on the checklist of what do we do and what's the most important things to do first. And you could argue that till you're blue in the face, but we want to understand the product first before we start trying to understand what else could
Yeah.
be problematic in combination with it.
Yeah. So, on the other end of the spectrum, in terms of benefits, the biggest potential benefits, do you see that as kratom being alternative for opioids, people being able to wane off of opioid addiction? Do you see the biggest potential benefit as just something like a replacement for coffee, anti-anxiety? What comes to mind when you think of like the biggest ways that kratom could change the world from a positive impact?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's definitely, from what I hear, uh, a lot of is for pain treatment and for mood anxiety, mood elevation, and anti-anxiety focus. Sort of, a lot of people say that it's really great for attention, and focus. So maybe ADHD, but it's one of those things that we really don't understand right now. Of course, I think our focus has really been looking at it as a treatment for opioid use disorder or opioid withdrawals, and that's something we really need. Could it be another product that could transition people from opioids to getting off of opioids and then eventually getting off of kratom? I mean, our two drugs for that right now are methadone and buprenorphine, and both of those are still opioids, and still used even in pain treatment as well. So you get somebody off of a prescription opiate that can cause euphoric highs to a prescription opiate that doesn't cause euphoric highs but is still an opiate, and you're still physically addicted to that substance, and you still have that dependence, and now you're in a chronic treatment with that substance. people get tired of it and want to get off of that because it's still a depressant. Maybe kratom has a place in that same space that wouldn't cause that sort of depression and would help with getting people transitioned off of those drugs. And so that's kind of the focus from where we come from. It's basically based on the expertise of what we understand and what we know and what we how to do in the lab. But at the same time, you can't ignore all the ways that people are using it or for what purposes people are using it, and a lot of that is for pain relief outside of opioids if they've ever used opioids. A lot of people talk about it for relief of intestinal problems as well. And so it's there's I think there's lots of ways that it can be helpful in the future, and some people say that it's a good deterrent to alcohol use.
Hmm.
They've been able to stop consuming as much alcohol as they've been consuming. They don't crave alcohol as much. They still can use alcohol, but that those are other anecdotal things we haven't really explored. I know there's some other labs working on looking at it for potential in alcoholism. So there's I think there's a lot of things, but as in a research world, you are almost pigeonholed into focusing on an area that you can get funding for, and then you chase that, and then as you can do it, you start to expand and get people interested in working with you on other topical areas. So yeah, I mean, mood, anxiety, improving mental health would go a long way in this country to helping with the substance use problems as well. So
Yeah.
all those things.
The decreased desire for alcohol is something that I've experienced as well. And I wouldn't say that it completely mitigates my drive for alcohol, but I have noticed that in situations where alcohol is an option, I'm much more likely to turn it down and just feel satisfied. It, like I'm not turning down the alcohol because I'm like, I don't want to drink tonight. I'm genuinely turning it down because I'm like, I feel fine right now. I feel good. I don't feel the desire to change the state that I'm in. This is good already, so I don't want to add anything to that. So I would say that I've experienced this uh not rejection of alcohol, but just like a feeling of I'm good, I'm okay. I don't really need it right now. So that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's something to it, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So did you visit Malaysia? Is
Yes,
that correct?
yes.
Because I'm so fascinated between the east and west uses of kratom. So I wanted to ask you, when you visited Malaysia, uh, what are some of the differences you saw with kratom use in terms of the attitudes and behaviors of people in Malaysia versus the United States?
So some of that broke up, but I the gist is I think what's the difference between the use.
Yeah, like the differences in behaviors and attitudes between the way people in Malaysia approach kratom and the way people in the United States, for example, approach it, like the East versus the West.
Yeah, in it's used in the rural parts of Malaysia and Thailand, and it's used a lot by laborers, farmers, outdoor workers, and it's a cultural. I mean, it's a cultural beverage, an everyday beverage in Malaysia, just like um, we use coffee. They're using kratom tea every day. It's also chewed, as I mentioned in Thailand. Fresh leaves are chewed by the same type of population in Thailand, and they use it every day to just give them more stimulation, more energy to tolerate that work environment. Um, so there's no taboo in use of it, I guess, is amongst the population that uses it. Interestingly enough, females generally, it is a taboo for. Females generally are not
Really?
seen in public using it. Most of the houses, particularly in Malaysia where I was, most of the houses will have their own trees growing in their yards, and they use their own personal consumption. It is sort of outlawed. It's not illegal, but there's restrictions on it in Malaysia where it can't be sold commercially. You can use it in personal consumption and whatnot, but that doesn't stop them. There's roadside stands where you can buy tea, where you can go in and sit down with other people, just like a coffee shop, and sit and talk and enjoy it. Um, it is a large Muslim community, and so they don't use alcohol. And many times on Friday or Saturday evenings when the men are socializing, they will socialize around a batch of the tea, and they will consume more than they normally do it, and then they will start to get to some of that feeling of the sedative feeling, the relaxant feeling of it, that what we would say more opioid like effect. But in general, that's not what they do on a day-to-day basis, and they will look at it from a standpoint of how I basically look at it in the morning when I have my coffee. Some mornings I don't even finish my first cup of coffee because it's like, that's enough, I'm good.
Yeah.
And some days I need 3 cups, right? And so they sort of titrate their dose as well. They'll drink what they need, but they generally consume it throughout the day, morning, afternoon, early evening, and that's sort of the way they approach it. And of course, what's interesting now that's happening in Southeast Asia is, because there's been so much attention of this in the Western world, some of the younger generation over in Malaysia are starting to experiment with different combinations of kratom tea with other substances, um, and trying to see if what's going on in the U.S. and how can we understand and enjoy whatever they're doing too. So I don't know that there's any real connection or learning from that. I think it's just that the popularity's increased around the globe, and that's sort of gotten the interest of the younger populations to start experimenting with things as well. So,
Yeah.
um, so those are the things that you see pretty much over there. Over here, I think we've covered a lot about um, what the reasoning for uses are, how people are using, and we see a variety of use patterns in the U.S. The majority of which I truly believe are people using it for a legitimate reason and not trying to seek some sort of mind altering uh, effect. They're looking at it for the beneficial effects. But we do have those extreme cases, and unfortunately, the extreme cases are the ones that end up presenting at emergency departments and poison control centers, and then those are the ones that end up becoming case reports in the medical literature that the physicians are reading, and then the physicians equate immediately kratom with bad and harm, and
Yeah.
they don't know the whole thing there. So that's another thing that we're trying to do, is really get education out. So I appreciate what you're doing, and bringing me on here and talk about this and get some more education out there. I'm excited because I gave a talk to the National Institutes of Health last year, and they've gone ahead and are working on trying to convert that into medical continuing education, and so that would go to physicians and nurses, and would be really helpful for them, and hopefully it'll make it through all the
Amazing.
approval processes. But
Yeah.
that's education is key in this.
Yeah, I mean, and going off of the education, it seems like for whatever reason, the Eastern society, the Eastern approach, there seems to be a little bit more respect for the power of plants and less of a tendency to concentrate that plant in extreme doses as opposed to like America. If we're good at anything with drugs, we're good at taking uh drugs that have other societies have been doing for thousands of years and being like, what if we take like 1,000 times the dose and see what happens? And I hope that doesn't happen with kratom. I hope the market kind of stays somewhat aligned with the traditional Southeast Asian use of kratom, where people aren't trying to get too crazy with it. But um, like, did you when you were over there and you're visiting the farms and you're seeing people who grow it, do you see more of a spiritual connection or emotional connection to the plant when you're talking to these people?
Yeah, there's definitely a respect. There's a respect there, and whether or not it's kratom, like you mentioned with other plants, I'm also attending meetings where people are talking about mushrooms, people are talking about ayahuasca, people are talking about coca leaf. They're talking about many of these other plants that have certainly the power to change your mental status depending on, again, the dose. But there's a big reverence for those plants. A cactus, there's a real reverence for those plants and the power of those plants, and not to try and abuse or take advantage of what Mother Nature and what the spirit world is providing, but to use that as a conduit to be able to, live with the world in a better way, to be more one with nature, to have the respect not only for those plants, but to come back mutually
Yeah.
to your fellow human being, right? So it's a very different attitude than sort of the selfish me, me, me. I want to feel good.
Yeah.
uh, attitude.
Yeah, it's so for me, this is just my own personal opinion, but the ritualistic aspect of making the tea and steaming the water, putting in the powder, mixing it, like I really enjoy the ritual of drinking kratom tea just like I would coffee. And it makes it more pronounced. And I feel that I'm doing something, I'm putting something into my body. Whereas I've experimented with the capsules, but it's just so easy to just take it and not think about it. And you can kind of
Yeah.
lose track. And it's not as meaningful of an experience because it takes 3 seconds. But for me, when there's a ritual behind it and it takes time and you're doing something physical and mental and in some ways spiritual, if you believe in a connection to plants and that a lot of plants have beneficial interactions with human beings. Maybe if I'm in a rush and I don't have time to make tea, maybe I just don't take kratom that day. If I don't have the time to make it and go through the ritual, maybe I don't pop a capsule. I enjoy that, and I feel like that's part of why I've managed to stay feeling fulfilled towards the lower dosage range because um not that I'm against capsules. People can take whatever they want, of course, but just like having the physical action of preparing it and drinking it like you would coffee or something, like the smell. A lot of people don't like the taste of it, but I think it's pretty good. It's definitely an acquired taste, but the ritual aspect has been something that I've really uh, begun to enjoy.
Yeah, and I think you see that with a fair number of coffee users now too, where they're doing pour over or French press or something that's not your typical just run in Starbucks and grab a cup of coffee. I sure know that I enjoy coffee a lot better when somebody who's roasted it that I know then goes through the whole sort of, as you say, it's not really a ceremony, but it's definitely a procedure of blooming it and preparing it in a way, and it no matter what, it seems like it tastes better. And it has a just better experience. So
I think it
I think
does. I think the ritual awakens something in the senses when you're physically doing something. There's there's a more of a charge to the taste, I feel like, and the effect rather than just kind of popping it and going about your day. Again, that's just me. People have all different types of experiences, but when I take the time to do it, it feels more meaningful, and that translates to the effect that it has. Um, what's the most surprising thing that you've learned about kratom in the lab? Something that you didn't expect. Maybe you were like, "Holy shit! Like this can't be true." Like anything that pops out that you came across that was completely unexpected.
Hmm, that's a great question. I think there's a lot. Because as we start to uncover more and more and more, it's uh, leading to more and more questions. Something that totally blew me away was the fact that that whole discussion that we had earlier about the 7-hydroxymitragynine, where we thought for sure, based on the literature and everything else, that it was derived from the plant. Um, Learning that it's probably not produced by the plant was a pretty eye opening experience, and understanding that. And then
Yeah.
another one to us that was really surprising was we were trying to understand plasma stability. So as we're understanding how these compounds behave in different species, we look at metabolism in different species livers. So we'll look at rat,
Mm.
mouse, dog, monkey, and human liver extract preparations, and then you can get an understanding of how stable these compounds are. We do the same thing with plasma. Um, human plasma, interestingly enough, the 7-hydroxymitragynine isn't stable in human plasma, um,
Mm.
and it converts into another product that we couldn't understand. It was decomposing into this other peak with the exact same molecular weight. So that means that something was happening to the molecule. It wasn't being changed by our body's metabolism, but something was happening. So we collected enough of it to figure out what it was, and sure enough, in human plasma, to a much greater extent than any other species, and it does happen in all the species, 7-hydroxymitragynine gets converted into a compound that's known as mitragynin pseudoindoxyl. And
Mm.
mitragynin pseudoindoxyl was first reported as a fungal metabolite. So some researchers fed mitragynin to a fungus, and that fungus spit out this mitragynin pseudoindoxyl. Well, it's even more potent opioid than the 7-hydroxy compound is.
Wow.
And so it made us kind of fearful in the beginning, because we said, wow, if this is being converted in humans to a much greater extent than any other species, then all the animal studies we're doing aren't really replicating what will happen in a human. Um, and then what we realized over time was
Mm.
that really there's not that much that gets produced in a human, and then what
Mm.
does get produced doesn't seem to cross. It doesn't seem to cross from the blood supply into the brain
Mm.
very efficiently. So then we got a little bit more relieved with all of that, and we monitor for it now. We are telling um, individuals that are looking at analysis for clinical trials that it's something that needs to be watched for, but we don't ever think it's going to get to a level of concern with a typical kratom dose. But I think those are
Mm.
probably the most surprising things we've learned. We've learned some things that about some of the individual compounds. Like I said, when we take them out and play them at full blast,
Mm.
we've
Yeah.
learned that some of them by themselves are pretty interesting, and pretty good inspirations for potentially developing, new classes of molecules um, to study different disease states. So, it's all of these are inspirational to us for drug synthesis on another level, and trying to understand how can we make um, compounds that could be beneficial as a pharmaceutical. But that's all inspiration from the natural product and understanding that natural product. And we have no intention, no matter what people say on Reddit about me, there's
Yeah.
no intention at all of ever trying to, reduce access or eliminate this from people being to use it. We're trying to figure out how can we make sure that people can continue to use it and use it safely and as I said, responsibly.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I wanted to get your thoughts on. Because there are posts on Reddit that people where people seem to think that the researchers studying kratom are out for a patent and money and limiting the widely available legal use. Do you get viewed as the enemy by people who message you occasionally? Like, what do you say in response to someone who sends you a message that says something along the lines of like, you're only studying this drug for your own financial benefit, or you're are in lockstep with the FDA, like you want to patent it, things like that? People who view you as the enemy of kratom.
Yeah, well, I mean, usually I don't usually answer a lot of emails, whether they're positive or negative, as I don't want to get into, back and forth discussions. I I'm very choosy about who I do answer and what I do respond to, and of course see a lot of things on social media and Reddit, and I feel like I almost get that gut feeling that I need to punch in and say that's not me or whatever. But
Yeah.
um, I just choose not to get down to that level and get into those types of discussions because based on my experience, those things never end well, and it can create more problems than it can solve. But at the end of the day, we're out here trying to get science done and trying to understand something that millions of people are using, and how can they use it safely and how can we keep that access to them. And so, like I said, yeah, we're going to get inspiration to potentially make new drugs, that would be different, not not the chemicals that are coming out of the plant per se, but that would be different. There is a lot of interest in mitragynin or mitragynine as a single chemical, to look at, but you
Hmm.
know what? You can't patent it. So
Yeah.
it's a natural product, and natural products are not patentable. They belong to Mother Nature and the world, and so there's no money to be made, unless there's chemical inspired derivatives that are made from these things, which would have nothing to do with eliminating or limiting the plant use. And in fact, the plant use, as I mentioned before, is this complex symphony orchestra that I don't think you can replicate if you
Mm.
don't have all the pieces and parts, in a single molecule. Single molecules could be interesting for treating specific diseases, for sure, but yeah, that's the farthest thing from where we ever have thought on this whole process is to to make money off of kratom. If I wanted to do that, I could be doing that hand over fist right now by starting my own company to sell products
Yeah.
right now and say, hey, look, I've built the science around this, I have that, I've got it all under control. So you
And
would
there
want to buy my product.
And there's so many people that create supplements that aren't backed by science, and you end up finding out that it's tainted, or the ingredients are what people say are in it, and making false claims about supplements that are shadily regulated. So yeah, you're right. If you wanted to do that, there's certainly a widely available opportunity to do so.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't mind um, money, but I have a great job. I love my job. We talked about that already. How much fun it is, and I love the fact that I get to work with future pharmacists. I get to work with
Mm,
future pharmaceutical scientists. I get to help shape who they are and what they're going to do in their future, and hopefully live by example that these are the things we need to do to contribute back to society and give back. And
mm,
I have a I'm not wealthy by any means, but I have a comfortable living, and I can't complain about that. And I do that in a legitimate way. So, I could easily run out and start my own kratom business.
yeah,
I've had lots of offers. Let's put it
yeah.
that way.
Yeah, one of the things that came up in terms of like the shady world of kratom, and you can tell me if you'd rather not comment on this, but I saw an investigative report by Nick Wing from the Huffington Post. He's an investigative reporter, and he found some things on the FDA possibly misrepresenting kratom deaths. Could I read you some stuff from that? And so there's an article in Nexus News, and the title is FOIA Docs, Freedom of Information Act documents show that FDA's data on kratom deaths is propaganda. And it's on Nexus News if people want to go see it. And this is based on Nick Wing's investigative report at Nick P. Wing on Twitter. And it reads, last month, Scott Gottlieb, Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, issued a public health advisory on kratom, outlining concerns about its quote unquote deadly risks. However, Nick Wing, a senior reporter at the Huffington Post, submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Food and Drug Administration to put a second set of eyes on those allegedly deadly associations. What the FDA released under the FOIA request is now raising serious concerns about the validity and perhaps the motive for the senseless government fear-mongering. In their report, the FDA cited 36 deaths associated with the use of kratom, but the data they released to Huffington Post showed only 8, and of those 8 reports, not a single one confirmed a death caused by kratom. The FDA chose to associate kratom with the person's death in the report below, despite the person having tested positive for tramadol and having a history of cardiac arrhythmia. So basically, there's screenshots of reports that were released under the Freedom of Information Act. And I can go through a few of them, but it's basically like reports associated or deaths that were equivocated to kratom deaths where there were other things in people's systems, or people had pre-existing conditions for decades that were not taken into account for whatever reason. So there was one person who had a quote unquote kratom death where they tested positive for tramadol and history of cardiac arrhythmia. In another case, the mother of a 27-year-old man who died in his sleep claimed that kratom killed him. The FDA associated the death with kratom in spite of the fact that he had multiple pre-existing conditions. He had SSRIs in his system and also muscle relaxers. A 63-year-old man on multiple prescription meds smoked for 40 years and had a heart attack. Despite cigarettes being the number one cause of preventable death in the U.S., his death was attributed to kratom. John Harden tragically lost his wife last month and reported her cause of death as kratom use. However, after further investigation by Thurston County coroner, kratom was not found in his wife Wendy's system at the time of her death, and yet the FDA continued to report it as a kratom death. So I just wanted to ask you, like, giving the FDA the benefit of the doubt. Like, there's no sort of conspiracy going on with the FDA, regardless of what people on Reddit say. Like, what reason would the FDA have for having an oversight with these deadly kratom narratives, and that's if the reports and claims are totally factual. So assuming these claims are true, or like, what is the FDA missing when they're looking at these kratom deaths based on what you've seen in the lab?
Yeah, so I can't speak for the FDA or what their thought process is or what they're doing. I can only speculate as to what's going on. But first, I will say I'm very familiar with all of those cases that you mentioned, and for sure there's very few, if any, um, deaths that have been linked solely to kratom, and those that have been linked solely to kratom, it's unknown if there was other substances that were adulterants in that kratom at the time. And so one of the things that we constantly um, um, came across in many of the death reports was fentanyl on board. And so fentanyl derivatives have creeped up everywhere. Fentanylogs, many of them are called, and they're more potent than fentanyl. And so if many of the deaths that were attributed to kratom were actually found to have fentanyl in them, or they were found to have benzodiazepines or other substances present, muscle relaxers, SSRIs. Those were some of the low-hanging fruits of what's going on, and we need to look at what drug herb interactions are happening between these. And we do know that some of the same metabolism pathways that are being used by the kratom alkaloids are used by prescription medications, particularly antidepressants, opioids. And so the fact that you could end up getting a potential drug interaction or drug herb interaction that would enhance levels to dangerous levels in your body that normally wouldn't be dangerous if you were just taking one or the other, but combining them becomes problematic. This is what's there. Now, I'll come back to the fact that we just don't know. The few cases where they said it was kratom only, we just don't know what else was in that kratom sample that person ingested, and unfortunately, we don't have the sample to go back and do forensic analysis on to see if there was any adulterant or contaminant in there. I mentioned we just did a huge screening of hundreds of kratom samples, and we did look for adulterants in those, and we did not find adulterants in any of them in
Wow.
the marketplace. So that was another
That was
good.
recently?
That was recently. We haven't published that yet, but that was another good feeling piece to us that there seems to be a good supply. And that as soon as I go and say that, then somebody's going to screw it up, and we'll have a report out
No,
in the
I'm
next
not,
few
I'm
months.
knocking on wood, so it's not gonna happen.
So I mean, hopefully that won't happen, of course. But it was good. We got the largest screen of products across the United States that's ever been conducted, and the consistency in the marketplace is pretty impressive, and that was a surprise to us. But coming back to the FDA, and again, the FDA's mission is to protect our population, to protect our citizens, and when they don't understand something, the propensity to err on the side of caution is high, and in their mind, I think, I don't know for sure, I'm speculating, but I think that when you tie an opioid narrative to a product, and we've already gone through that early in this conversation, but when there's an opioid active substance out there available that's unregulated, um, it becomes a health concern. Whether or not it's understood at the time is irrelevant. It becomes a concern that the FDA rightfully should be looking at to protect our
Mm,
population, right? And so I don't think they're doing anything in a malicious, evil way. They're trying to underscore and make draw attention to the fact that this could be problematic, right?
mm,
Um, and the fact that I think there could be some um, there could be some reasoning that they have to try to focus it more on kratom than the other substances that were together, just to make an awareness and heighten the danger that could be out there. I don't know. Like I said, I'm not the FDA, and I'm definitely not talking to people at the levels that were
yeah.
speaking for the FDA on this. So I really think it comes down to the fact that here we are in the middle of an opioid crisis. You've got another potential opioid-like substance that's out there. Um, what should we do? What should we
Yeah.
do to protect the public? And I think that's where they come from. Um, at least I'd like to believe that's where they come from. Of course, there's people that have other thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah. And everything that you've described on the podcast about kratom seems so promising and beneficial when the drug is respected and when people are acting on the proper information. Do you anticipate, because of the the potential for kratom to do things like replace opioids, like not that it's going to happen, but like people already anecdotally using it as a replacement for drugs that are prescribed. Do you anticipate a big fight by big pharma in the future to make kratom go away? Like, do you think the 2016 blip was just like the first speed bump in the road of many speed bumps for kratom, or do you think those type of speed bumps are going to largely go away as more and more research comes out?
Yeah, if I had a crystal ball, I wish I could tell you. You know, it's hard to say. It's really hard to say. I think
Yeah, I
that
guess if you, no one knows the future, but if you had to
yeah.
speculate,
I
I
mean,
know obviously you don't speak for big pharma, but just from some of the things that you've seen with other drugs in the past,
I
would
mean,
you?
I served as president of the American Association of Pharmaceutical Scientists, which is the largest organization that brings together academics, government, and pharma, pharma folks. I know a lot of people in a lot of positions in pharma and government, and I can say that I've never heard anybody from pharma side of the world even talk about kratom and that being a concern for what they're doing. So I know that that narrative gets out there. There's a large concern and potential conspiracy theories that they're going to crush it and not want to do anything with it. Um, Actually, if they find out that there's something really of value there and they can benefit from it, they would probably pursue some of these other avenues that we talked about earlier, which would be looking at how can we make a single chemical entity pharmaceutical out
Mm,
of this that we could definitely patent and profit from, and it's not going to be from isolating the natural product. I mean, like I said before, you can't patent that, you can't make money from that. But if they see that there's an avenue based on what we learn from the science of this plant that could be beneficial and better for treating humans, in a more controlled single chemical entity sort of way, I'm sure they would pursue that instead of trying to squash a botanical that's out there. I just
yeah,
I don't see it happening.
yeah, that's a good point. It has. Would you say that your work has brought you to have any sort of spiritual view on kratom or plants in general? Just with everything you've done and spending time testing these plants and seeing how they interact with different beings, do you ever just sit back and think, like, on a deeper spiritual level, what the future of human plant interactions may look like, or just the energy of plants in general?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that over the years and everything that's happened, because we've had ups and downs with this project. We've had times where we didn't have funding. We had times where it was difficult to push our research forward. Then we ran into the DEA speed bump, where
Yeah.
we thought everything was going to be made illegal, and we essentially shut down our lab and packaged up everything and sent it to a friend and colleague that could hold it for us because they had a Schedule One license. We didn't. Um,
Wow. So
we
you were like on the brink that, like, you
yeah,
it could have all been shut down.
we literally packed up everything, shut down everything, and waited. And fortunately, we were able to continue, and fortunately, we were able to get funding and really move forward. But I think coming back to that whole thing and discussion is that I think this plant somehow has sought me out as much as I've sought it out. And I'm not a user of it. I've tried it. When I was in Malaysia, I figured I'd try the traditional preparation and just see what it was like. And it really didn't do anything for me except numb my mouth up a little bit.
Mm,
And I didn't push it. I didn't try to have more than a glass. So, but I wanted to experience it. And the taste. You're right. It's an acquired taste for sure.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I truly believe that somehow I've been able to figure out how to keep this research going, how to keep moving it forward. Things happen that, as I mentioned, we have a huge team now. Once we moved from Mississippi to Florida, we got heavily into the agricultural side of understanding how the tree grows, what it does, trying to break a lot of the myths from the cultivation side, from the cuttings, making cuttings and rooting cuttings, and can you grow it from seed or not grow it from seed. And we've answered a lot of those questions, and understanding what the nutrient needs are for these trees and the climate needs. And it's gone way beyond what we initially set out to do, which was just understand the pharmacology of the plant and the chemistry. Now we've gone all the way to understanding how do we grow the tree, how is the tree producing these chemicals, why is the tree producing these chemicals. And we have some ideas around that as well. It's definitely not to treat people, right? It's a some sort of environmental protective response
Mm,
for these trees growing in a very harsh environment of humidity and swampy, muddy lands that are very rich in microbial life and fungal life. So there's possibilities that these trees are producing these chemicals to keep themselves alive and healthy and not get infected from other things in the environment. So we've learned a lot. We've learned to respect the tree. We've watched these trees grow. We've learned to see how they respond to different environmental conditions. We've obviously done a lot of work to pull things out of the plant and study those things. And so I don't think that this work would have continued if it wasn't supposed to continue, and if I wasn't supposed to somehow be a part of that, and then to tie that into some greater plan of we're supposed to be the ones helping to really unveil and understand what this plant's capable of doing and
Yeah.
what it needs to do to provide for people around us. So I think I kind of can get a little spiritual around that part of it, right? So
Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say because the way that you speak about the symphony orchestra of the alkaloids and the metaphors that you use for pharmacology, you seem to have such an appreciation for the beauty of pharmacology and plant species interaction, whether it's mice in a lab or humans taking it for whatever reason. The way that you talk about it seems like there's an appreciation for the beauty and like on a deeper level of what's happening, and it's inspiring the way that you talk about your work, because I can tell that you genuinely love what you do. And you know it might be hard for you as a or not hard for you as a researcher, but like maybe it's not in your best interest to talk about plants on like a higher spiritual, like a woo woo plane. But I can at least say that I think there's some sort of higher plane of plant human interaction that we don't yet understand, that goes beyond the basic pharmacology understanding of today, that maybe 10, 50, 100 years in the future we're aware of the way that plants and humans can come together symbiotically in ways that we couldn't even imagine today.
yeah, no, for sure. And thank you for the
Yeah.
kind words.
Yeah.
I'm glad my passion for what I do shows.
Yeah,
So
yeah, of course, of course. As as we end off, I wanted to ask you some more general questions, some ridiculous questions too. We'll see where it leads. So there's a scene in The Happening where Mark Wahlberg talks to plants. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Happening. It's one of his bombs, but it's if you watch it without the expectation of needing it to be a deep film, it's actually very entertaining. It's like funny in how serious it's trying to be. And there's one scene in The Happening where Mark Wahlberg is talking to plants. Like the plants are releasing some sort of spore that is attacking people's minds and causing them to kill themselves. And so he's like talking to the plant, like asking it why it's doing this. Totally ridiculous question. Maybe it's not so ridiculous, but like when you're in a room full of kratom plants, have you ever, whispered a mantra or asked the plant, like, where do I go from here? Like if you're stuck at a dead end and you're like, I don't know, like, what should you ever just like
yeah, no,
ask the plants where to go?
it's not that ridiculous of a question. I mean, I think we've run into that. We've run into that many times, and the trip to Malaysia was really really special because being able to be in stands of trees growing in their natural environment, and really trying to figure out what do we need to do, where do we go from here, how do we make this more impactful,
Mm,
beyond just studying the chemistry and the pharmacology. How do we really start to impact the world, and how do we impact any policy and any kind of things that might come up in the future? And I'm proud to say that because of that, we have collaborations with scientists in Southeast Asia and Malaysia and Thailand and Indonesia, and we've learned what they're doing and what they know, and a lot of that has influenced global policy even to this point, because we got to speak to the World Health Organization. The expert committee on drug dependency
wow.
considered an international global ban on kratom, and there was 10 scientists that presented in that session, and essentially the World Health Organization said, look, this is a traditional medicine that's been used in part of the world for centuries. It's used in some religious capacities, and there looks like there's medical potential here. And so the World Health Organization said we're going to keep an eye on it, but we're not going to do anything to restrict it or ban its use in the world.
So I didn't even know that you can internationally ban a drug globally, like just all countries. Like your country doesn't even get a chance to vote on it if it goes through the WHO.
Yeah, yeah. And that was
Wow.
some of the narrative of the conspiracy theories as well.
Yeah.
Like, well, if the U.S. can't do it by themselves, maybe they're the ones that went to the World Health Organization and
Yeah.
said, "Hey, you guys ban it."
So what drugs are banned internationally right now? Because I'm
There's a number you can look on the World Health
yeah.
Organization's website under I mean I can't tell you off the top of my head, but many of them are different derivatives of substances that we already know are no medical use, no potential.
Okay.
They're just dangerous. So that's where that is.
Is it kind of like the national drug laws in the US versus state? Like their weed is federally illegal, but if Colorado votes to legalize it, the feds aren't gonna try to wipe the state off the map. Like if a country wanted to
Yeah, I mean
legalize a
it's
drug that
one
was
thing
on the
to
WHO
outlaw
list,
something and then
would they come after
yeah.
them or?
Yeah, it's one thing to outlaw a substance and then you have to enforce that, right?
Yeah.
So it's you can put a global ban on something and then if some country doesn't want to participate, they don't have to participate.
Okay. So it's more like a
But if
suggestion
you
than
put a
a
global
legally
ban on
binding thing.
uh
It's more like a
yes and
suggestion
no.
that
I
yeah.
mean I think it comes down to enforcement.
Mm,
It's just like the USDA has regulations around dietary supplements and products, but they don't have enough people to enforce the regulations,
mm,
and so
mm.
it's it's difficult, and that's a
Yeah.
whole nother big discussion too.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. So you gave a TED talk called "Seeing Pain," and everyone should go check that out. And it particularly hit home for me because you talk about reversing nerve damage, and I actually had two ulnar nerve transpositions during my baseball career. I played baseball from the time I was 5 years old to 23, and my career ultimately came to an end because of lingering nerve damage in my left elbow. So I was very interested in what you had to say for the potential of nerve damage being able to be reversed by the drugs that you were studying in sigma proteins. And that could be an entirely different podcast. We could probably go 3 hours on that. At the beginning of the TED Talk, you mentioned that you lost an uncle to alcohol abuse before you ever became interested in drugs. So I wanted to ask you, how do you think losing your uncle to alcohol abuse shaped the way that you look at pain and drugs today?
yeah, it definitely got me interested in understanding how drugs that are supposed to help you could turn bad, or how something that's widely available like alcohol, um, that seem to be pretty commonly accepted in society, could cause someone to go down the slippery slope and end up dead because of it. I just I didn't understand much of that when I was younger. Still don't understand it fully as an
Mm,
adult, and that's part of why I started sort of got interested in this. Always had an interest in chemistry, always had an interest in pharmacy, always had an interest in natural products, and particularly the philosophy that I've carried with me from the time I was a teenager was that we have diseases that are caused by nature, um, and so it would only make sense that the cures for those diseases would be out in nature as well, and
mm,
so we should be really finding those things because even if we induced something chemically, it still happened because of some natural event. And so that was kind of my philosophy in those areas. And a lot of people look at natural products for treating cancer or bacterial diseases. um, uh, but I just thought, there's got to be some natural products out there. There's so many that are psychoactive. Maybe they're beneficial by themselves, but maybe there's other substances out there that could help, with people that have problems with some of those psychoactive substances. So all of that sort of played into that philosophy of why I wanted to do that. And I my PhD work was looking at making compounds from Lobella inflata, which is Native American tobacco, not cigarette tobacco, but was a different type of tobacco. We were looking at it for nicotine cessation or Alzheimer's disease treatment, and then I did my post PhD work in opioid chemistry, particularly trying to understand, opiate addiction and how we could better treat opiate abuse, and then I just carried that sort of same mentality on into my own career, and where we've been going with everything. And so that's kind of where all that comes from. The other thing is that relating back to your nerve injury, when I was 4 years old, I fell through a plate glass door.
Oh shit.
And severed my nerve and artery in my right arm. Basically, I almost lost my right arm right at this level. In fact, can't get my shirt up there, but got a huge scar under there. And I was fortunate because we were in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I grew up, and they were clinical trialing, having clinical trials on microsurgery in pediatrics, and so they were able to reconnect nerve fibers and reconnect all the blood vessels. And thank goodness today I still have my original parts. So but because of that, I have some severe nerve issues, and I was always interested in how could we better understand nerve function and nerve conduction and pain, and why are there phantom pains, and why do we still have these irritations years after it should be healed and better. And so we did that whole project that you mentioned, the sigma proteins.
Yeah.
We actually have a compound that's been in almost 200 human beings now as a diagnostic, looking at nerve damage. We've actually been successful in helping a few people be completely cured of pain, because there
That's
was
amazing.
certain things that we were able to identify and work in partnerships with their surgeons to manipulate and fix. And yeah, I mean, it's awesome. And then the whole flip side of that is trying to come up with drugs to treat pain that aren't opioids, that are just as effective as opioids but don't have the side effects. And so I have that's where, if I'm going to make money someday, that's where I hope to do it, because those are chemicals that were born out of the brain, and really trying to understand different pieces and parts of the human physiology and pharmacology, from a completely total synthetic molecule standpoint of view, which is that whole project. It's really cool.
Yeah.
And we're just really excited about where that could take off to, again, to benefit people. And the fact that we were able to help somebody and cure somebody of chronic pain that they had on a 8 to 10 every day, on a pain scale of 1 to 10, they were living 8 to 10 every day for 8 years. And we were able to get them back to normal, get their leg back to normal muscle tone and everything, and they're completely pain free today. So it's just,
that's amazing.
If nothing else happens, I'm happy, right?
That's amazing. I wanted to ask you just quickly about Chat GPT. So first, have you used Chat GPT? Are you aware of what it is and its capabilities?
No.
So Chat GPT is an AI language learning system that is the first serious competitor to Google. So essentially, you type in something that you would ask Google, like, for example, what is a good chest workout I can do today? And instead of Google giving you a million searches based on chest workouts and giving you different articles and things like that, ChatGPT software spits out an answer formulated through artificial intelligence and combing through, billions of data points across the internet, YouTube, Wikipedia, and it will say something like a good chest workout is the following: do 3 sets of 5 dumbbell presses with 2 minutes rest, do three, and it'll say this whole thing. And then at the end, it'll say it is important to note that working out is good for human health and things like this. And it's at the very early stages, but essentially it's an artificial intelligence uh, answering system, and it's taken the internet by storm in the past few weeks. So
Well, thanks for pointing.
yeah, definitely. If you play around with Chat GPT, there's so many people on it. The servers get overwhelmed at times during the day, but like in the morning or at night, typically there are less people on it. And just ask it questions about. I'm sure even Kratom. I'm sure it would surprise you the things that it's able to pull up and just spit you out a succinct 1 to 2 paragraph answer on some things that maybe you already know, but you just want to test its knowledge. And I was playing around with it the past few weeks. I've even asked it, like what are good podcast questions to ask a pharmacologist, or what are good podcast questions to ask a stand-up comedian, just to see what it would spit out. And I wanted to ask you if you had any thoughts on the future of AI and drug research, if you think there might be some sort of AI assisted drug trial, or I don't even know what that would look like. Maybe artificial intelligence, uh, some sort of implant where it's like telling you like what are the ideal drugs that you should take and you shouldn't take based on billions of genetic data points, things like that. Do you have any sort of thoughts on the future of AI and drug research?
Yeah, well, I can tell you that particularly in the University of Florida, we have a huge AI initiative, and we've hired lots of people in the health sciences, particularly in drug discovery area, to look at those tools and use those tools and start to figure out how we can improve all of the things you just mentioned. So yeah, there's a huge space.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a huge part of the future. So
Yeah, definitely go play around with it. Chat GPT, and anyone listening, just ask it more specific questions. I asked Chat GPT to write a romantic poem that I could send my girlfriend. And I said that my girlfriend's actually a neuroscientist. So I said, my girlfriend's a neuroscientist. She's French. And I think I said she likes coffee or something. And then ChatGPT spit out this beautifully written poem. And I sent my girlfriend, and she's like, "Oh my God, that's amazing." I was like, "I didn't write that. It was it was ChatGPT." But yeah, it's pretty mind blowing. But thank you so much, Dr. Chris McCurdy, for your time. This has been an absolute blast. I'm fascinated by your research from a personal standpoint, but also just for the future of Kratom and the Kratom community. So thank you so much for your time. This has been an absolute blast.
thanks. Thank you, Zach. I appreciate you having me on.
Of course, thank you.
All right. Good
So,
luck with everything.
thanks.